TLS certificates, the idea behind this was essentially I've had various conversations in the past with people about how certificates work. It is something that is not that straightforward, especially if you're not thinking about it every day. If you're fortunate not to have to think about it every day. So I thought it would be useful to do a bit of a talk, so we get an overview what certificates are and how we use them and whatnot, and also to act as a document that anybody that needs to could refer back to in the future if they wished. It hopefully shouldn't be too long either, and feel free to interrupt if need be. So first off, what are certificates? Certificates on their own are just part of a mechanism to allow us to initiate encrypted connections without the need to share secrets in advance. So we're not having to tell each other a password through some other mechanism to set up some encrypted connection. It can all be done automatically without those secrets, which is all made possible through public key cryptography. And that needs two parts, a public part and a private part. So our public part is our certificate, in our case. And what that means is that anybody can have that certificate, and anyone who has that can encrypt messages to send to us. Then the private part is the private key, and only we have that. We have to keep that safe and secret. And then any messages that are received by us, we can decrypt just with that private key. And that private key and the certificate are, the certificate is derived from the private key, so they're tied together. Now, in practice, of course, this is all handled for us, those parts. Now, to create a certificate, we have a little process to go through. So first off, we generate our private key. There's nothing particularly exciting about that. It's just a cryptographic key. There's no particular details in it. But we then use that to generate a certificate signing request. So that has the public key part that is derived from the private key, and it also contains a load of details that we provide that essentially describe our server that we want to have a certificate for. So when we have that certificate signing a request, we can send that over to a certificate authority who will then sign that request and send us back a certificate. And that certificate authority could be a public provider like Let's Encrypt, who have an automated process to do the signing, or it could be a commercial entity that will do some checks of their own to ensure that we're the correct person, that we're allowed to have a certificate for that server. Or the certificate authority could be essentially us making up our own one. Now, looking at what's inside the certificate authority, they have their own set of certificates and private keys. As you can see there, there's the root certificate and then an intermediate certificate. And the idea that we're going to come on to is that we want to be able to build a chain of trust from a root certificate, which the client is going to use to verify our certificate, all the way down to our certificate. So what typically happens on a sort of crude level is the certificate authority have their root certificate, which is the final certificate in the chain, or the first certificate in the chain. That will then sign an intermediate certificate that you can see there as well. And then the intermediate certificate is used to sign any server certificates that are required. The reason that there's that sort of two-level setup is to give us extra security at the certificate authority. If we use the root certificate to sign all of the server certificates coming in, then the private key for that certificate would have to be available and online at all time, and there's a greater risk that that then could be compromised. By having this intermediate certificate down the way, the private key for the root certificate can be stored offline. That means it can't be compromised. if the intermediate certificate is then compromised, then we can generate a new one later on. Yes, Stefan.
Yeah, one question. So you need the private key to sign the signing request?
Yes.
Okay.
Because otherwise, because that's the secret bit. If you only needed the root certificate to sign things, then we all have access to Google's root certificate. We could sign things on behalf of Google. It's the private key that is involved in doing the signing, essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's probably all I needed to say about that. And that just, I've got a couple of slides in here where I just repeated briefly what I said in text. So we don't need to cover that. That's just if you come back to it in the future. So it's also useful to consider what a certificate has inside it. So this is a textual representation, which we'll just go through. It's not as scary as it looks. So first off, we have a serial number. This is not particularly interesting in of itself. It just is a random number which is unique to this certificate. So if you have every other detail being the same, this serial number will still be different. So you can distinguish between certificates always. We also have a validity period. So this is the server certificate from test.mosquitto.org. And you can see there it's not valid after June 2030. So I've still got 8 years before I need to worry about changing that. Absolutely. We also have some information on the subject of the certificate. That means the server this refers to. In the orange, there is the sort of the technical bits about the public key. The actual public key I've removed just because it's too big to fit on here. It's not very interesting. We've got the other technical details there about the what algorithms used and that sort of thing. Then in the yellow is the actual the subject of this certificate. These are the details that I provided to the certificate authority, which in this case was me, about that I wanted to put into the certificate. So in this case, we've got a bit of geographic information there, so country, state, locality, and then the O there stands for organisation, Mosquitto, an organisational unit, public server. But none of those are particularly required, and you know, I don't believe that there's any particular checks done on any of those within the, in any server implementations. Although you could do, of course. The important one there is CN, which stands for common name, and this is almost always the host name of the server that's involved. And that's something that you then use in verification, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We've also got information on the signature provided by the certificate authority. So again, the orange bits are the technical bits that we don't especially worry about too much at the moment. The yellow is then the subject line from the issuer, so the certificate authority. So in this particular case, you can see that the issuer was also me, except this time it's in the organisational unit of CA. Like I say, this is the bit that I've made up. If this was a Let's Encrypt certificate, then there'd be something about Let's Encrypt in there in the issuer that we would see there, and they would be a bit more different. Okay, and that again just repeats what I've just said. So when we want to use these, we've really talked about server certificates so far. So how do we actually go on and use them? So as I mentioned, we want to get this list of this chain of trust from the root certificate, which the client holds, as is essentially saying anything that's signed by this certificate I will trust and that I will be allowed to connect to. So we need to build that chain from the root certificate down to our server certificate. So the client contains the CA root certificates it trusts, and then the server has its own certificate, but it also needs the intermediate certificates. So essentially the full chain apart from the root certificate, and it also needs its own private key, of course. for doing any of the decryption. So then when we want to connect, what, very crudely this is, of course, the client connects and the server sends its certificates. So in this case, the server certificate and the intermediate certificate sends those to the client. The client builds that chain and then carries out its verification. So is there a valid and trusted signature on each of these different certificates that I've been given that match my root CA certificate? Is it the correct host name? So that was the common name part that I mentioned using for verification. If I know I'm trying to connect to test.mosquitto.org and the certificate is for sidalo.com, then there's a good chance someone's trying to spoof my server. I've connected to the wrong thing, so I shouldn't carry on connecting anymore. So quite an important check, that one. Also, is the certificate still valid? Is it still got a valid date, I should say? And you can do all the verification steps, but those are kind of the important ones. If any of those fail, then the client will disconnect. Now, we also are interested in client certificates. So we always start from the point of view that there is a server certificate. We kind of need that bit. We can optionally have client certificates as well. Now, this slide is almost exactly a copy of the one from a few pages ago, except where everywhere that it says client, it now says server, and everywhere it said server, it now says client. So we have the server has its own root certificate that it trusts. The client has its certificate and any intermediates. The client also has its private key. And this I think this is really quite a critical point here, that this is exactly the same process in both sides, whether you're going from the server to the client or from the client to the server. Everything works the same way, but also those two root certificates, those client certificates, compared to the server ones, can be completely unrelated. It's a really important distinction there. Now, when we come on to actually, again, use those certificates, as I said, we already need to do the server certificate verification from before. I'm just going to come to Stefan because I think you might have had a question about that previous slide. Yes, Stefan.
It's more about that intermediate certificate, client certificate stuff. So in the end, you have, at least what I know, a PEM file that contains the certificates. Do I have then 2 lines in there, or how does that work?
Yeah. So you'd have have those certificates pasted together in a particular order. I can't remember which way, whether it's the server first and then the intermediate, or the other way around. But yes, you have those. So like with Let's Encrypt, they by default provide server.pem and fullchain.pem, which contains the intermediate as well.
Mm-hmm. The question is, why do I have to give that orange one? If I anyhow always have to give the intermediate certificate, so I always have to give them both, or
what we have to do is we always have to have a complete chain. If we don't, so the server would. Okay, I'm just going to go back a few slides just because it's kind of makes more. This is more the way we usually think about it. The client has the root certificate that it trusts, and the point is we want to keep that root certificate. We don't want the client to have the intermediates, so that the intermediates could be changed if necessary. Mm-hmm. But if someone has to have the intermediate certificate, otherwise there's going to be a gap in the chain, and the client will say, "Well, I've got a root certificate. You've got a server certificate. I can't trust it." Now, I mean, I've put here that we've got the intermediate certificate there. In the case of client certificates, when I'm doing it on test.mosquitto, generating these certificates through the web page, I don't have an intermediate. It's just root certificate and then client. The same argument applies about the security of the root certificate, but I guess maybe you might be less inclined to use an intermediate, maybe. I mean, I think there's definite value there in terms of from a slightly different perspective to a server certificate, because you could have an intermediate certificate which was assigned to a certain group of clients, and a different intermediate was assigned to a different group of clients, and then you'd be able to revoke certificates. You got a bit more control over how you could revoke things, for example.
Yeah, from my also what I've seen in the past is that you do some type of, and that's for example also what Microsoft is using in the IoT Azure, that you do overlapping validity using different intermediate certificates. So you have a very, very long living root certificate, and then you create an intermediate certificate which is valid only for a year. And then half a year later, you create a new intermediate certificate, which is also valid for a year. And then you have something like 6 months to move with the client certificates from one intermediate to the next one. This gives you different overlaps and opportunities. That's another use case I've seen in the past that you do this rollout. What is not shown here in the picture is that the key for this intermediate certificate, this also has a key that is kept in the server. That's never handed out for the client, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's secret.
That's secret, right? Yeah. So you hand out the intermediate certificate to the client together with the client certificate and the private key for the client if you have created it, but you keep the intermediate certificate key in your server and never hand it out.
Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, in terms of the connection process, we're going to connect just like before. The server certificate verification happens just as we did before, and then the client will send its certificates to the server, and then the server carries out the verification. So it's that mirrored, basically the same sort of checks happening with client certificates as they were with the server certificates, checking whether we've got the signatures correct and the dates are correct. What doesn't tend to happen is that there's a host name check, because it was the client that initiated the connection, so it doesn't quite make as much sense. And again, if any of these checks fail, then the server will disconnect the client. And what that means is that if we control the CA, the certificate authority, then this is effectively an authentication step, because we're only going to give certificates to things that we trust, that we want to connect. And that is just one of the differences there between the server and client. This should say server certificate authority certificates rather than just certificates. So where you've got a server certificate, the CA can be public, like Let's Encrypt, because there's not really a danger in that being public. I mean, you could have it as a completely private CA if you wanted to, but you don't really need to. By contrast, the client, the CA for that absolutely should be private, because the whole point of having client certificates really is to control who can connect to our server. If we were letting anybody with a Let's Encrypt certificate connect to our server, then that's basically no point anymore. And the final point, which I have mentioned already, is that both the server and the client can use the same certificate authority, but it's not required. So if we may want the convenience of having a Let's Encrypt certificate for the server, and then we would have to have a separate CA for the client side. A couple of other topics that don't kind of exactly fit into either of those other titles. So we can have extensions to the certificates to add extra features. And the most important one for us really is subject alternative name. So I already mentioned about the host names being used for verification, using the common name part of the certificate, and that the client definitely should be checking that against what it's trying to connect to. And that's great, but it's quite limiting because it's only a single field. So you may want to have a certificate support multiple host names, for example, and this subject alternative name is an extension that enables that. So you can see in the highlighted text below, we've got three IP addresses in yellow that are being considered to be valid for this whatever certificate, and two made-up host names that would also be considered to be valid for a certificate as well. So 5 different things rather than just one. So that's real benefit in some situations. I also did mention revoking certificates as well briefly. So if a client private key, or the server private keys, of course, is compromised, then we can tell the server not to accept the corresponding certificate for that private key. So the CA would then generate a certificate revocation list, which is loaded into the broker, and that then acts as an additional verification step during the connection phase. Both servers and clients can trust multiple CAs at the same time, which is, of course, what your browser does every time you're using it. More than 100 CAs likely to be on your computer, all notionally trusted by you. Now, my opinion is that in the context of an IoT device, we don't need to be trusting that many different CAs. There's probably only needs to be trusting 1 or maybe 2 different CAs at once. So that does simplify things just a little bit. And that's kind of all I wanted to tell you about. Were there any other questions? Yes, somebody. Titian.
Hi. Can you go 2 slides back, please? Yes, the revocation list. Why is that necessary? Why don't you just create the whole process new? Because you have to give out the certificates anyway, again. Why do you do a blacklist instead of just redo the whole process? Is that easier in a way, or?
Yeah, it's totally easier. So if you think that we've got, if we've generated certificates for 1,000 devices, and we then have on our server a single certificate authority certificate, which is the one that has signed all of those, and then one of those devices is compromised, and so we don't want it to be able to connect anymore, and we generate a blacklist for that single device, it can no longer connect, but everything else can. If we want to redo everything, we'd have to redo the other 999 ones at the same time.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you all for listening. I will put that document, such as it is, somewhere on the shared drive.